You call this an essay? I expected better from you.
She looks really mad this time.
The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Roosevelt High School, casting long rectangles of light across the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk old books and the lingering scent of cleaning solution from the janitor's early morning work. It was a room that had seen generations of students come and go, walls peppered with faded motivational posters and peeling paint that whispered stories of ambition, failure, and hope. At the front of the classroom, Mrs. Evelyn Hargrave, a teacher whose career spanned nearly 30 years, adjusted her glasses, her lips pursed in habitual judgment. She had that practiced air of authority that demanded obedience, the kind that could make even the boldest student hesitate before speaking. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the rows of students as if measuring them, weighing them, deciding in a silent, invisible ledger who belonged and who didn't. Among the students, sitting at the third row from the front, was 12-year-old Marcus Johnson, a boy whose worn-out shoes tapped nervously against the scuffed linoleum floor. His backpack, frayed at the edges, sat at his feet like a faithful companion. Marcus had been up since dawn, helping his mother prepare breakfast and walking the 2 miles to school, the morning chill nipping at his ears. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, a resilience that came not from entitlement but from necessity, from a life where every achievement was hard-won and every setback felt personal. Today, however, there was an undercurrent of tension in the air that made Marcus tighten his grip on his pencil, his knuckles whitening. He knew this day would not be like the others. Mrs. Hargrave's voice cut through the room with the sharpness of a scalpel. "Marcus, please read your paragraph aloud. Your assignment was to write about a role model in your life, and I want to see how much thought you put into this. Let's see if you can actually meet the expectations I have for a student in my class." Her tone carried that subtle bite of condescension that didn't just question ability, but questioned worth. The other students shuffled their papers, some avoiding eye contact with Marcus, others whispering behind their hands. Marcus cleared his throat and began, his voice steady but soft, almost hesitant. "My father has always been my inspiration. He taught me the importance of discipline, of responsibility, and of believing in something bigger than myself. He has served our country with honor, and his dedication to protecting others has shaped the person I am becoming." He glanced at Mrs. Hargrave, hoping she would nod, perhaps offer a word of encouragement. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, a patronizing smirk curling at the corner of her mouth. "Oh, really, Marcus? You expect me to believe that? Your dad, a soldier, huh? And let me guess, you think he's some big-shot general?" Her tone escalated, dripping with skepticism, disbelief, and something darker, an unspoken bias that tightened the air around him. Marcus felt a familiar sting in his chest. He had faced doubters before, but the weight of a teacher's derision carried a different kind of shame, one that felt like it could echo into every part of his school life. He held his chin high and spoke, each word deliberate. "Yes, ma'am. My father is a 4-star general in the United States Army. He's worked his entire life to reach that rank. He started just like any other soldier, but through years of service, sacrifice, and dedication, he earned his position." The words felt heavy and important in his mouth, as if every syllable carried the sweat, discipline, and unwavering commitment of his father. The classroom fell into an uneasy silence, the kind that happens when a statement challenges assumptions so starkly that even the air seems to pause. Mrs. Hargrave's eyes narrowed, the smirk vanishing as a flicker of irritation crossed her face. She tapped her pen against her desk, her knuckles whitening. And then she did something Marcus had not expected. She ripped the paper from his notebook, crumpled it in her hand, and flung it onto the desk in front of her. "This is preposterous," she snapped, her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Your father cannot possibly be a general. Look at you. Your shoes, your uniform, the way you speak. None of this fits the image of a general's family. You must be making this up." The words landed like a punch, unfair and cutting, a mixture of ignorance, prejudice, and outright cruelty. Marcus felt the heat rise in his cheeks, but kept his voice calm. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, some sympathetic, some shocked, others unsure how to react. He breathed deeply, steadying himself against the tide of judgment that threatened to pull him under. "My father's achievements are not defined by appearances, Mrs. Hargrave," Marcus said quietly, yet with a firmness that made his voice carry across the room. "He has spent decades serving this country, rising through the ranks through merit, courage, and leadership. I am proud of him, and I will not apologize for his accomplishments or for mine." There was a ripple through the classroom, a subtle shift in energy as students exchanged glances, sensing the gravity of the confrontation. Mrs. Hargrave's lips pressed together, her jaw tightening, but she was not finished. "I've seen plenty of students lie to puff themselves up. Are you saying you're exempt from reality? That somehow your life is different from the rest?" Her voice wavered slightly now, a mixture of anger and disbelief. Marcus felt the tension in his chest transform into a quiet resolve. He knew the truth, he knew the facts, and that knowledge fortified him like armor. Just then, the door to the classroom opened abruptly, drawing everyone's attention. In the doorway stood a tall, imposing man in a crisp military uniform, adorned with the insignia of a four-star general. His presence filled the room with an immediate gravity. The man's gaze swept across the classroom, landing on Marcus, and then on the teacher who had just challenged the boy's truth. The general's posture was rigid, commanding respect without a word. Mrs. Hargrave froze, her mouth slightly open, eyes wide, as the weight of reality struck her. The paper she had crumpled moments before now seemed insignificant in comparison to the uniformed figure standing in the doorway. Marcus straightened, a mixture of pride and quiet vindication washing over him. This was not the moment of loud confrontation, but of quiet, undeniable truth, a truth that no prejudice could erase. The room remained still, a tableau of surprise and confrontation. Marcus's classmates, who had been silent witnesses, now stared in awe and disbelief. Mrs. Hargrave, who had so confidently asserted her judgment, looked as if she were seeing the world shift under her feet. Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions, vindication, pride, and a sudden, almost surreal calm. In that moment, the classroom, once a stage for doubt and prejudice, became a place where truth could no longer be denied. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed brighter somehow, illuminating not just the dust motes, but the quiet courage of a boy who refused to let ignorance define him. And as the general's gaze softened when it met his son's, Marcus realized that this day, this confrontation, would be remembered far longer than any classroom lecture, far longer than any crumpled paper. The weight of truth, finally recognized, had a power that nothing else could match. Mrs. Hargrave's hand shook slightly as she held the crumpled paper in front of her, the edges bent and creased from the force with which she had torn it from Marcus's notebook. Her eyes darted between the boy and the figure at the door, struggling to reconcile what she had dismissed as a childish fabrication with the undeniable reality before her. The classroom, once filled with a low murmur of restless students and the scratch of pencils against paper, had fallen into a tense silence that seemed almost sacred. The general's polished black shoes reflected the fluorescent lights overhead, each step he took toward the front of the room resonating like a metronome, marking time with authority and precision. His uniform, immaculate and decorated with ribbons and medals, spoke not only of rank, but of decades of service, sacrifice, and commitment. The air around him carried the weight of command, the kind of presence that demanded attention without a single word. Marcus felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with a mixture of awe and relief. He had known his father's achievements, he had seen his father's dedication firsthand, but seeing him now in front of those who doubted brought a surreal validation, a proof that words alone could not convey. Mrs. Hargrave finally managed to find her voice, though it was tinged with an incredulous tremor. I didn't realize. This doesn't. How could I have? Her sentences faltered, each one collapsing under the weight of her embarrassment. She looked down at Marcus, then back at the general, who now stood just a few feet away, his gaze steady and unwavering. Marcus, he said, his voice calm but commanding, thank you for speaking the truth. I am proud of your courage. It takes character to stand up when others doubt you, even when those doubts come from someone in a position of authority. Marcus swallowed hard, feeling the warm surge of pride mix with a lingering tension from the teacher's prior words. He nodded quietly, unsure of what to say, yet feeling the validation resonate through every fiber of his being. Around him, the other students leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of awe, curiosity, and a dawning realization that what they had witnessed was extraordinary. Whispers began to ripple through the room, soft at first, then growing louder. "That's his dad." "No way. Wow, he really is a general. Did she just—" Each whisper was a pebble causing ripples across a once stagnant pond, shaking assumptions, questioning beliefs, and slowly redrawing the invisible lines of hierarchy in the classroom. Mrs. Hargrave's face flushed red, a combination of embarrassment, anger, and a gnawing recognition of her own bias. She clutched the desk for support, the weight of authority she had wielded for decades now seeming fragile, almost laughable. I must have been mistaken," she stammered, each word brittle, struggling to regain control over a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond her expectations. The general, however, was patient, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. He did not need to assert dominance. The truth of his presence, the undeniable evidence of Marcus's pride and courage, spoke louder than any reprimand could. His eyes softened when they met his son's, a quiet acknowledgement of resilience, of a boy who had held fast to integrity even in the face of prejudice. Marcus felt the subtle shift in his father's expression, the pride, the warmth, and the recognition that he had passed a silent test of character. He straightened in his seat, feeling the combined weight of relief and vindication settle over him like a protective cloak. The classroom, which had moments ago been a stage for bias and judgment, now seemed infused with a new energy, one that whispered possibilities rather than limitations. The general took another step forward, his polished shoes making a subtle clicking sound against the tile, commanding attention without the need for dramatic gestures. "Mrs. Hargrave," he said, his tone firm but measured, "it is important that our children are encouraged to speak truthfully about their families and their achievements. Prejudice has no place in education, and dismissing a student's word based on appearances alone undermines the very foundation of learning and respect. Marcus has demonstrated integrity and courage today, qualities that every educator should nurture, not ridicule." His words reverberated through the classroom, leaving a tangible impression on every student present. Marcus felt his shoulders relax slightly, knowing that his father's presence and voice carried a weight that no teacher's prejudice could overcome. Some students whispered to one another, sharing glances that spoke volumes. This was more than a lesson in family pride. It was a lesson in justice, in fairness, in confronting biases head-on. Mrs. Hargrave opened her mouth, clearly struggling to respond. She shuffled papers nervously, her posture rigid, and muttered, I didn't realize. I shouldn't have." Her voice trailed off, leaving a vacuum that the general filled with quiet authority. He glanced at Marcus once more, then back at the class, and added, "Let this be a moment to remember. Never judge someone based on appearances or assumptions. Character, integrity, and perseverance are what truly define a person." The students nodded, some murmuring agreement, others simply staring in astonishment. Marcus, sitting at his desk, felt a sense of vindication so profound it nearly made him dizzy. He had weathered skepticism, endured prejudice, and emerged with truth on his side. The classroom, once a place of judgment and doubt, had transformed into a space of acknowledgement and respect. For the first time that day, Marcus allowed himself to smile, a quiet, triumphant smile that radiated inwardly, unseen by most but deeply felt. As the general finally turned to leave, his presence lingering like a shadow that commanded both respect and reflection, Mrs. Hargrave sank slightly into her chair, a mixture of humility and chagrin washing over her. Marcus's classmates continued to murmur, their eyes reflecting a mixture of admiration and astonishment. The lesson had extended far beyond the boundaries of the textbook. It was a lesson in courage, in truth, and in confronting the assumptions we hold about others. Marcus realized that this moment would not be forgotten, that the weight of his father's presence had rewritten the narrative of the day, challenging prejudice and rewriting the unspoken rules of authority within the classroom. In that silence, punctuated only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway, Marcus felt a quiet certainty. Standing up for truth, even when doubted, could shift the world in ways that were both subtle and profound. The silence that followed the general's departure was thick and almost tangible, as if the classroom itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would unfold next. Marcus sat at his desk, feeling the adrenaline slowly ebb from his body, leaving behind a peculiar mixture of relief, pride, and exhaustion. His pencil, which had been clutched so tightly moments before that it threatened to snap, now rested loosely between his fingers. The room felt different somehow, charged with an invisible energy that had not been there at the start of the day, a mixture of awe, respect, and the kind of quiet reverence that accompanies a truth too powerful to ignore. Around him, his classmates shifted in their seats, glancing at each other with wide eyes and murmuring softly, their voices hushed as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile atmosphere. "Did you see that?" whispered one boy, his face pale with astonishment. That was unbelievable. A girl in the back nodded, her hands folded neatly on her desk, her lips pressed tightly together. "I can't believe she actually doubted him," she murmured, disbelief heavy in her tone. The room was alive with a subtle hum of whispered speculation, each student processing what they had just witnessed in their own way. The teacher, Mrs. Hargrave, sat frozen behind her desk, her face pale, her hands gripping the edges of the surface as though she could anchor herself to it and somehow regain control. The familiar sense of authority she had wielded effortlessly for decades now felt tenuous, fragile, almost laughably inadequate in the face of undeniable truth. For Marcus, the moments that followed were surreal. His heart still raced from the confrontation, but now it was tempered by a profound sense of validation. He had spoken his truth in the face of skepticism, and the universe, in the form of his father's very real presence, had confirmed it. He looked around at his classmates, many of whom were staring at him with newfound respect, their previous assumptions dissolving in the wake of reality. For some, it was a lesson in humility. For others, a shock that challenged their own subconscious biases. The boy who had been laughed at, doubted, and dismissed was suddenly a figure of admiration, a living testament to integrity and resilience. Marcus felt a strange warmth in his chest, the satisfaction that comes from having one's character affirmed, not by empty praise, but by the undeniable truth of experience and action. He realized almost in a quiet epiphany that this moment was not just about proving a point. It was about setting an example, showing that prejudice, no matter how deeply ingrained, could be confronted and dismantled with courage and honesty. Mrs. Hargrave finally exhaled, a long, shaky breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades of unexamined assumptions. Her hands released the edge of the desk, and for the first time, she looked at Marcus not as a student she could dismiss, but as a human being whose truth she had underestimated. There was a subtle shift in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, and perhaps even shame, though neither she nor the classroom was yet ready to acknowledge it fully. She cleared her throat, attempting to regain composure, but the words she formed sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Marcus, I see now," she started, her voice trailing off as if the sentence itself could not bear the weight of the reality before her. The students, sensing the vulnerability in their teacher, leaned forward, their attention unwavering, as though waiting for her next move. Some exchanged looks of astonishment and empathy, recognizing that even authority figures could be humbled, could be forced to confront the biases they had carried silently or unconsciously for years. The classroom had shifted from a battleground of prejudice to a space of reflection, not just for Marcus, but for everyone present. Marcus's gaze fell to his hands for a moment, his fingers flexing around the pencil, then lifted to meet the eyes of his classmates. In those silent exchanges, he felt the unspoken acknowledgement. They had witnessed courage, they had seen truth triumph over assumption, and they had learned, in their own way, the importance of standing firm when doubted. He did not speak immediately, Words seemed unnecessary. The room vibrated with unspoken lessons, a quiet respect that enveloped him like a protective shield. He thought of his father, of the sacrifices he had made, the discipline, the long nights and early mornings, the battles fought both on the field and within the mind. That dedication had shaped Marcus as surely as it had shaped the general, and now it was being recognized not with fanfare or applause, but with a subtle, powerful acknowledgement of peers who had borne witness to integrity in action. Each glance from a classmate, each hesitant nod, carried weight far heavier than any lecture or assignment. Mrs. Hargrave, meanwhile, sat back in her chair, finally allowing herself a moment of introspection. She reflected on the way she had judged Marcus, on the assumptions she had allowed to shape her perception. Her mind raced, circling back over her career, her expectations, the countless students she had evaluated and dismissed without considering the full measure of their lives outside the classroom. She realized, with a mix of fear and humility, that today's confrontation was more than a challenge. It was a mirror, reflecting the biases she had failed to acknowledge. For Marcus, the lesson extended beyond simple vindication. He recognized that some battles were not won through argument or confrontation alone, but by maintaining dignity and patience, letting the truth reveal itself in its own time. The general's arrival had crystallized this truth, demonstrating the quiet, undeniable power of proof over prejudice. The students began to settle slowly into their seats, their whispers fading into thoughtful silence. Some hunched over their desks, pretending to write, while their minds replayed the confrontation, each interpreting the events through their own experiences and understanding. Marcus remained seated, upright, calm, and quietly proud. The tension that had gripped him earlier had been replaced by a steady awareness of accomplishment, a feeling that transcended personal victory and touched something larger, the affirmation that truth, courage, and perseverance could shift perceptions, even in spaces dominated by authority and bias. As the classroom absorbed this new energy, Marcus understood something essential. Moments like these, rare and transformative, carried lessons that extended far beyond the walls of any school. They shaped character, challenged assumptions, and left indelible impressions on those who bore witness. The following days at Roosevelt High School carried a tension that was almost palpable, a shift in the invisible currents that ran through the hallways, classrooms, and cafeteria. Marcus walked to school with the same measured steps he always took, his worn shoes tapping softly against the cracked sidewalks, but the world around him now seemed subtly altered. Whispers followed him, not in the mocking way they once had, but with a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and cautious respect. Students who had barely acknowledged his presence before now offered nods or tentative smiles as he passed. Some whispered in groups, glancing in his direction as if analyzing a case study. The boy whose father was a 4-star general, the boy who had stood his ground against a teacher's prejudice and had been validated in the most undeniable way possible. Marcus could feel their eyes, sometimes weighing him, sometimes studying him, and he realized that the confrontation in Mrs. Hargrave's classroom had shifted not only her perception, but the perception of everyone around him. It was a strange sensation, being both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, moving through the familiar spaces of his school, as though they had been subtly, irrevocably redefined. He had never sought attention. He had never asked to be a symbol or an example, but now he was aware that every step, every glance, carried unspoken weight. Mrs. Hargrave herself moved through the classroom with a tentative caution that had never existed before. Her usual authoritative presence seemed muted, softened by the humility and reflection the confrontation had forced upon her. When Marcus entered her class, she no longer fixed him with a sharp, scrutinizing gaze. Instead, her eyes followed him with a mixture of acknowledgement and uncertainty, as if she were treading lightly on ground she no longer fully commanded. She began to call on him with less judgment and more curiosity, though each question carried a subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation. Marcus, ever composed, responded with clarity, precision, and the calm confidence of someone who knew both his own truth and the patience to navigate the fragile dynamics of authority. He realized that part of his quiet strength was now as much about restraint as it was about courage. He would not flaunt the victory of being right, but he also would not allow others to diminish it. In the delicate balance of classroom power, Marcus walked a tightrope, carrying both the weight of integrity and the subtle awareness that he had become a symbol of justice in a microcosm where prejudice had briefly reared its head. Conversations in the hallways, at lunch tables, and in gym class reflected the subtle but undeniable impact of the event. Students who had once ignored him now approached with tentative questions, trying to understand what it meant to have a parent in such a prominent position, and whether Marcus himself had been different before the confrontation. Some expressed admiration for the way he had handled Mrs. Hargrave, quietly standing firm without lashing out or creating a spectacle. Others were more skeptical, unsure whether this newfound respect would last, or if it would fade like a passing rumor. Marcus listened carefully, choosing his words thoughtfully when responding. He felt a quiet responsibility to set the tone, to show that the event was not about arrogance or boasting, but about truth and integrity. In the cafeteria, a group of students even invited him to sit with them, a gesture that was subtle but significant. The table was not reserved in deference to his father's rank, but rather because of the respect Marcus had earned on his own terms, through courage, honesty, and poise in the face of disbelief. Yet, despite the outward change, subtle tensions lingered, particularly with Mrs. Hargrave. While she no longer openly mocked him, there were moments when her expectations carried an undercurrent of wariness. She would glance at him before speaking, as if measuring the consequences of each word, or pause for a heartbeat before calling on him, carefully calculating the interaction. Marcus noticed this, but he did not let it unnerve him. Instead, he treated each encounter with quiet observation, learning not only how to navigate authority, but how to maintain dignity and composure under scrutiny. He understood that prejudice, even when tempered by respect or fear, could persist subtly, hiding beneath politeness or formality. Marcus became adept at reading the subtle signals, the tightening of a jaw, the slight narrowing of eyes, the hesitation before a question, understanding that these moments were as much about character as the louder confrontations of before. In doing so, he cultivated a patience and awareness that strengthened his confidence, allowing him to carry himself with a quiet authority that could neither be denied nor diminished by prejudice. Outside the classroom, Marcus's reputation began to ripple through the school in ways that extended beyond immediate interactions. Teachers whispered to one another in staff rooms, commenting on the courage and composure of a student who had handled a confrontation with remarkable maturity. Students shared stories in hushed tones, embellishing slightly, as is inevitable in rumor, but always returning to the core truth. Marcus had stood firm, refused to be diminished, and been validated in a manner so definitive that it could not be denied. In these ripples, Marcus realized that influence could be quiet yet profound, shaping perceptions and expectations in ways that were subtle but lasting. He did not revel in this attention, but he acknowledged its presence, understanding that every word he spoke, every action he took, now carried a weight that extended beyond his immediate circle. Integrity, he learned, was not merely personal. It had the power to reshape the perceptions and attitudes of an entire community, even a microcosm like his high school. By the end of the week, the classroom environment had subtly transformed. Marcus's peers treated him with a combination of respect and admiration, often seeking his input or quietly acknowledging his presence. Mrs. Hargrave, while still wrestling with her internalized biases, approached him with a professionalism and cautious civility she had never exhibited before. Marcus navigated this new dynamic with a calm self-assurance of someone who had faced skepticism and emerged validated, learning that true strength often lay in measured responses rather than confrontation. Every glance, every interaction, every whispered acknowledgement reinforced a truth Marcus had long understood, but now saw reflected in the world around him. Integrity and courage, even in the smallest moments, can shift perceptions, challenge prejudice, and leave a lasting mark on those who bear witness. By the middle of the following week, the energy in Mrs. Hargrave's classroom had subtly shifted, though not without its complexities. Marcus moved through the room with a quiet confidence, aware of the new attention he garnered from his classmates, yet careful not to allow it to inflate his sense of self. The whispers and glances that had followed him in the first days after the confrontation had now taken on a more thoughtful tone, less gossip and more consideration. Students who had once dismissed him now lingered near his desk, asking questions about his assignments, seeking his opinions on topics, or simply finding comfort in the presence of someone who had demonstrated remarkable courage. Some of the quieter students, who had previously hidden in the shadows of the classroom, began to emerge with subtle shifts in posture and expression, emboldened by the example Marcus had set. He became, in small ways, a symbol of integrity, showing that perseverance, patience, and truth could command respect even in spaces dominated by authority or prejudice. Mrs. Hargrave, meanwhile, moved through her daily routine with an awareness she had never consciously maintained before. She graded papers, assigned readings, and conducted lessons, but every interaction with Marcus carried a subtle calculation, a mental adjustment born from the earlier confrontation. When she posed questions to the class, she found herself hesitating before calling on him, not out of doubt in his ability, but out of a newfound respect tinged with uncertainty. She noticed how his answers were precise, thoughtful, and composed, the kind that left little room for challenge or doubt. She observed how his classmates now treated him with quiet deference, their eyes often flicking toward him for guidance or validation. The subtle authority he carried had nothing to do with defiance or arrogance. It was rooted in truth, in the courage to speak when challenged, and in the unshakable presence that comes from knowing one's own worth. For Mrs. Hargrave, this realization was a humbling experience, forcing her to confront not only the biases she had projected onto Marcus, but also the ways in which those biases had shaped her interactions with countless students over the years. Marcus, sensing the subtle shifts in the classroom, chose to navigate them with careful restraint. He understood that influence could be wielded quietly, without ostentation or force. When students sought his input, he responded with patience and clarity, never allowing his growing reputation to overshadow the content of his work or the sincerity of his guidance. He noticed how the teacher's glances lingered longer than before, as if she were measuring his words and demeanor against the shadow of her previous assumptions. Marcus did not resent her scrutiny. Instead, he accepted it as part of the evolving dynamic, understanding that prejudice, once challenged, does not vanish instantly. It leaves traces, subtle hesitations, and unspoken questions that must be met with calm authority and unwavering integrity. In this way, Marcus became not only a student, but an exemplar, demonstrating the power of steadfastness and honesty in environments where assumptions often cloud judgment. Conversations among students began to reflect the broader lessons embedded in the confrontation. In the cafeteria, at the lockers, and during gym class, whispers and murmurs carried not just curiosity about Marcus's father or astonishment at his courage, but reflections on their own behavior, biases, and assumptions. "I can't believe I ever doubted him," one student confessed quietly to a friend, shaking their head. "He handled it so calmly, and she couldn't argue with him." Another student, more reflective, added, "It makes you think we shouldn't judge people just by what we see or assume. Maybe we need to pay attention to what they actually do and say." Marcus overheard snippets of these conversations, and though he said little in response, he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that his actions had prompted reflection, not just recognition. Influence, he realized, was subtle but enduring, capable of reshaping perceptions, challenging biases, and inspiring those around him to reconsider long-held assumptions. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hargrave's internal struggle continued, a quiet tension that she could not entirely conceal. She graded assignments with meticulous care, often lingering over Marcus's work longer than any other student's, scrutinizing not for flaws but for evidence of character, of thoughtfulness, of the qualities she had once dismissed. She found herself reflecting on the assumptions she had made, not only about Marcus's family, but about what it meant to succeed, to be disciplined, and to command respect. Each lesson she delivered was now tempered by a subtle awareness. Her words carried weight, her judgments mattered, and the biases she failed to acknowledge could have profound impacts on the students entrusted to her care. Marcus, unaware of much of this silent reckoning, simply continued to move through the classroom with quiet dignity, his presence itself a lesson that transcended any curriculum or lecture. By the end of the week, it was clear that the classroom had entered a new equilibrium. Marcus's influence, though unspoken, was evident in the way his peers collaborated, the way discussions unfolded, and even in the cautious but evolving demeanor of Mrs. Hargrave. Prejudice had not vanished entirely, it rarely does, but it had been confronted, challenged, and tempered by undeniable truth and steady courage. Marcus understood that this transformation was not just personal, it was communal. The classroom, once a space where assumptions and biases had gone unchallenged, now carried the possibility of reflection, growth, and subtle reform. He recognized that standing firm, speaking truth, and maintaining integrity were not solitary acts of defiance. They were seeds planted in the minds and hearts of those around him, capable of influencing behavior, reshaping perceptions, and challenging the quiet prejudices that lingered in unexpected places. By the time the following week arrived, Roosevelt High School had subtly but unmistakably shifted in ways that few could articulate fully, yet everyone felt. Marcus noticed it in the hallways first, the quiet nods from students who had once ignored him, the way groups made space for him without announcement, and the slightly more considerate tone of whispers that had previously carried an undercurrent of gossip or judgment. There was a new awareness in the air, a recognition that the classroom was no longer a place where assumptions could dominate unchecked, where appearances dictated respect, or where a student's word could be casually dismissed. Marcus felt a quiet pride, not in himself, but in the truth that had prevailed, and in the subtle influence that truth carried across peers and teachers alike. He noticed how even students who were not particularly close to him now sought his guidance in group projects or class discussions, respecting the quiet authority he wielded without words. It was as if the courage he had displayed, once validated by his father's undeniable presence, had rippled outward, teaching lessons about integrity, dignity, and the importance of standing firm in one's convictions. Mrs. Hargrave, for her part, began to adjust her teaching approach in subtle but meaningful ways. Gone were the moments of immediate skepticism or dismissal when Marcus, or any student, presented an argument or defended a position. She found herself pausing, listening more carefully, and questioning her own assumptions before speaking. It was not perfection, not a complete eradication of bias, but it was a deliberate effort to reconsider the lens through which she evaluated her students. She began to engage Marcus and other students more thoughtfully, seeking to understand the substance of their work rather than reacting instinctively to appearances or preconceptions. In these moments, Marcus observed her change not with triumph or judgment, but with quiet acknowledgement, an awareness that human beings, even those in positions of authority, could grow, adapt, and learn when confronted with undeniable truth. The shift was subtle, but its effects were profound. The classroom, once a stage for prejudice, was becoming a space for reflection, curiosity, and respectful dialogue. Beyond the classroom, Marcus noticed the effects of his actions in the broader school environment. Conversations among students carried new weight, gossip gave way to discussion, and assumptions were more frequently questioned than accepted. He saw younger students, who had once been intimidated by appearances or social hierarchy, now taking small risks, raising hands in class, sharing ideas, or standing firm on their own truths. The cafeteria, hallways, and library all seemed to hum with a quiet awareness that courage and integrity had tangible power, that standing up for what was right could reshape not just a single moment, but an entire social landscape. Marcus understood, with growing clarity, that influence was rarely loud or immediate. Instead, it worked in quiet increments, in subtle shifts in behavior and perception, in moments when people who had once assumed the worst began to reconsider and reflect. He carried this understanding with him, a steady anchor, knowing that his actions were not just personal victories, but lessons lived and witnessed by a wider community. Mrs. Hargrave's transformation, though gradual, became more visible in the interactions she had with her entire class. She began to encourage discussion, foster critical thinking, and actively challenge her own assumptions. Marcus noticed how she no longer preemptively dismissed a student's claim or presumed ignorance. She listened, weighed arguments, and engaged with curiosity. In moments when a student hesitated, she offered guidance rather than judgment, drawing on her growing awareness that every student carried untold experiences, truths, and potential. Marcus realized that the courage he had displayed, supported by the undeniable validation of his father's presence, had catalyzed not only peer respect, but genuine change in authority. It was not instantaneous, nor was it complete, but it was real, a reminder that confronting prejudice with dignity could ripple far beyond a single classroom or moment. As the week progressed, Marcus also began to notice the quiet support of his peers. Students who had once ignored or overlooked him now sought him out for help, advice, or simply conversation. These interactions were not performative. They carried authenticity, a recognition that Marcus had demonstrated qualities worth emulating: courage, patience, and unshakable integrity. He realized that the respect he had earned was not rooted in status, in privilege, or in fear, but in the simple, profound act of standing firm in truth despite doubt and prejudice. Each interaction reinforced the idea that influence came not from loud displays of authority, but from consistent, principled behavior observed and internalized by others. Marcus's confidence grew quietly, grounded not in ego, but in the awareness that his actions could inspire reflection, understanding, and even change in others. By the end of the week, the classroom had been transformed in subtle but powerful ways. Prejudice, while not entirely gone, had been challenged and tempered by the undeniable truth of Marcus's courage. Mrs. Hargrave approached each lesson with more awareness, listening more deeply and questioning her own assumptions before responding. His peers treated him with a combination of respect, admiration, and quiet curiosity, influenced not by his father's rank, but by Marcus's own composure and integrity. The school itself, in microcosm, had become a space where truth and courage could shift dynamics, reshape perceptions, and challenge deeply ingrained assumptions. Marcus understood that the moment in the classroom, the confrontation, the validation, and the subtle transformation it sparked would leave a lasting imprint, not just on him, but on everyone who had witnessed it. He realized with quiet certainty that courage was contagious, integrity was visible, and standing firm in truth could create ripples far beyond what any single person could imagine.